Marcus Chen had always been the kind of person who followed the crowd. At 28, he worked a dead-end job at a marketing firm, lived in a cramped apartment, and spent his evenings scrolling through social media, watching other people live the lives he wished he had. His colleagues barely noticed him, his boss treated him like furniture, and his friends only called when they needed something. He was invisible, forgettable, and completely powerless. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. Marcus was sitting in yet another pointless meeting, watching his supervisor take credit for his ideas, when something inside him snapped. Not in an explosive way, but like a switch being flipped. He looked around the conference room at the faces of people who had been walking over him for years and made a silent promise to himself: this would be the last time he would allow anyone to treat him as if he didn't matter. That evening, Marcus walked into a used bookstore near his apartment. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to clear his head. As he wandered through the narrow aisles, his fingers traced along the spines of countless books until they stopped on one that seemed to call to him, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. He had heard of it before, knew it was supposed to be about power and politics, but had never bothered to read it. Something told him this was exactly what he needed. Marcus bought the book and went straight home. He made himself a cup of coffee, turned off his phone, and began to read. What he discovered in those pages would change everything about how he saw the world and his place in it. Machiavelli wasn't just writing about ruling kingdoms, he was describing the fundamental principles of power, influence, and control that apply to every aspect of human interaction. The first lesson that hit Marcus like a lightning bolt was the concept of separation. Machiavelli wrote about how a prince must sometimes distance himself from his subjects, how fear could be more reliable than love, and how maintaining a certain mystery and unpredictability was essential to holding power. Marcus realized that his entire approach to life had been backwards. He had been trying to please everyone, to fit in, to be liked. But, in doing so, he had made himself weak, predictable, and easily dismissed. Over the next several weeks, Marcus began to study Machiavelli's teachings like a scholar preparing for the most important exam of his life. He read The Prince 3 times, taking detailed notes, and then moved on to Machiavelli's other works. He studied the historical examples, the political strategies, and the psychological insights. But, more importantly, he began to see how these ancient principles could be applied to modern life. The first change Marcus made was simple but profound: he stopped being available to everyone all the time. For years, he had been the person people turned to when they needed a favor, a ride, money, or just someone to listen to their problems. He was always saying yes, always accommodating, always putting other people's needs before his own. Machiavelli had written about the importance of scarcity and the danger of being taken for granted. Marcus realized that by being constantly available, he had made himself valueless in other people's eyes. So he started saying no. When his coworker asked him to stay late to finish her project, he politely declined and left at exactly 5 o'clock. When his friend called at midnight wanting to complain about his girlfriend for the 100th time, Marcus let it go to voicemail. When his neighbor asked him to walk her dog because she was too hungover, he said he had other commitments. At first, people were surprised. Some were even annoyed. But Marcus noticed something interesting: instead of losing respect, he seemed to be gaining it. The second principle Marcus embraced was the power of calculated unpredictability. Machiavelli had emphasized that a prince should never allow his enemies or even his allies to completely understand his intentions. Marcus began to apply this concept to his daily interactions. Instead of being the reliable, predictable person he had always been, he started introducing elements of surprise into his behavior. At work, Marcus stopped following his usual routines. Some days he would arrive early and work with intense focus. Other days he would take long lunches and seem completely relaxed. When people tried to engage him in office gossip, he would sometimes participate briefly and, other times, politely excuse himself to focus on more important matters. His responses became harder to predict, which made people pay more attention to him. But the most significant change came when Marcus began to understand Machiavelli's teachings about the relationship between fear and respect. The Italian philosopher had argued that while being loved was nice, being feared was far more reliable for maintaining power and influence. Marcus realized that he didn't need to become cruel or aggressive, but he did need to develop what Machiavelli called controlled intimidation, the ability to make others understand that there would be consequences for disrespecting him. This lesson became real during a staff meeting in November. Marcus had been working on a comprehensive marketing proposal for weeks, putting in extra hours and conducting thorough research. During the presentation, his supervisor began to interrupt him, dismissing his ideas and suggesting that perhaps someone with more experience should take over the project. In the past, Marcus would have quietly accepted this humiliation. But not anymore. Marcus stopped speaking and looked directly at his supervisor. The room fell silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undertone that everyone in the room could feel. "I appreciate your feedback," he said, "but I've spent considerable time and effort developing this strategy based on solid market research. If you'd like to discuss specific concerns after the presentation, I'm happy to address them with supporting data." He then continued with his presentation as if nothing had happened. The supervisor, caught off guard by Marcus's unexpected assertiveness, didn't interrupt again. More importantly, Marcus noticed that his colleagues were paying attention to him in a way they never had before. They saw that he was no longer the pushover they had known. He had drawn a line, and everyone in that room understood it. But Marcus was careful not to let this new confidence turn into arrogance. Machiavelli had written extensively about the dangers of overreach and the importance of understanding one's own limitations. Marcus continued to be professional, helpful when appropriate, and collaborative on important projects. The difference was that he now chose when and how to engage, rather than simply reacting to whatever others demanded of him. As winter approached, Marcus began to notice the effects of his transformation. People at work started coming to him for advice. His opinions carried more weight in meetings. His supervisor, rather than trying to overshadow him, began treating him as a valuable team member. The change wasn't just professional, it extended to every area of his life. His friends noticed that he had become more selective about how he spent his time. Instead of being available for every social gathering or crisis, he chose the activities and relationships that truly mattered to him. This scarcity made his presence more valued. When Marcus did show up to events, people were genuinely happy to see him. His opinions were sought out, his stories were listened to with interest, and his company was appreciated in a way it had never been before. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were moments when Marcus felt lonely, when the old impulse to please everyone would creep back in. He missed the simple comfort of being needed, even if it meant being used. But every time he was tempted to slip back into his old patterns, he would remember Machiavelli's central lesson: true power comes not from being loved by everyone, but from being respected by those who matter. Marcus also learned that separation didn't mean isolation. Machiavelli had written about the importance of choosing one's circle carefully, of surrounding oneself with people who added value rather than those who simply took it. Marcus began to evaluate his relationships more strategically. He started spending more time with colleagues who challenged him intellectually, friends who supported his growth, and family members who appreciated his new confidence. By December, the change in Marcus was unmistakable. He had lost weight, not from dieting but from the stress of constantly worrying about other people's opinions. His posture was straighter, his voice was clearer, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose and self-respect that others couldn't help but notice. The most surprising discovery was that by separating himself from the need for constant approval, Marcus had actually become more magnetic. People were drawn to his newfound confidence, his unpredictability, and his selective availability. He wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore, which paradoxically made him more impressive. At the company Christmas party, Marcus observed the dynamics around him with new eyes. He watched his colleagues vie for attention, try to please the bosses, and engage in petty office politics. He saw how desperate some of them were to be noticed, to be liked, to be included. A year ago, he would have been right there with them, fighting for scraps of recognition. Now he stood slightly apart, engaging when it suited him, contributing meaningfully to conversations, and leaving early when the evening had run its course. As he walked home through the cold December air, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few months. He wasn't a different person exactly, but he had become the person he was always meant to be, someone who understood his own worth and wasn't afraid to demand that others recognize it too. The old Marcus would have seen this transformation as selfish or manipulative. But Machiavelli had taught him that there was a difference between being cruel and being strategic, between being loved and being respected. The goal wasn't to hurt others or to become a tyrant, but to create a life where he had genuine influence and authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. As he unlocked his apartment door, Marcus smiled to himself. This was just the beginning. He had learned the first and most important lesson of Machiavelli's philosophy: to become truly powerful, one must first separate oneself from the desperate need to please everyone else. Only by standing apart could one gain the perspective and strength necessary to truly lead. The next phase of his journey would be even more challenging, but Marcus was ready. He had tasted what it felt like to be respected rather than taken for granted, and there was no going back. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to apply these principles, new tests of his resolve, and new chances to build the kind of life he had always wanted but never believed he deserved. Marcus Chen was no longer invisible. He was becoming unstoppable. Building the unstoppable mindset. January brought new challenges and opportunities for Marcus. The holiday break had given him time to further study Machiavelli's works and plan his next moves. He had successfully implemented the principle of separation, but now he needed to develop what the Italian philosopher called virtù, the combination of skill, cunning, and adaptability that separated true leaders from those who simply held positions of authority. Marcus returned to work with a clear strategy. He had spent the break analyzing his workplace like a battlefield, identifying the key players, understanding the informal power structures, and mapping out the opportunities for advancement. Machiavelli had written that a wise prince must understand the terrain before engaging in any campaign. Marcus now sought his office environment with the eyes of a strategist rather than a passive participant. The first opportunity came sooner than expected. The company had landed a major client, and the executives were looking for someone to lead a new project that could significantly impact the firm's future. In the past, Marcus would have hoped someone might notice his potential and offer him the chance. Now, he understood that opportunities were not given, they were taken by those bold enough to seize them. Marcus prepared meticulously. He researched the client's industry, studied their competitors, and developed a comprehensive proposal that addressed not just what they wanted, but what they didn't yet know they needed. But, more importantly, he positioned himself strategically. Instead of simply submitting his proposal through normal channels, he scheduled a brief meeting with the senior partner who would be making the decision. The meeting was set for 15 minutes, but Marcus made every second count. He didn't ask for the opportunity, he presented himself as the solution to a problem the partner was facing. Using insights from Machiavelli about the psychology of power, Marcus appealed to the partner's self-interest while demonstrating his own competence. He showed how his proposal would not only benefit the client but would enhance the partner's reputation within the firm. "I've identified 3 critical areas where we can exceed the client's expectations while creating additional revenue streams," Marcus said, maintaining steady eye contact. "The research is complete, the strategy is sound, and I'm prepared to take full responsibility for the results." He didn't beg or plead. He simply presented facts and waited for the partner to recognize the obvious choice. The partner studied Marcus carefully. This was not the same person who had been invisible in meetings just months before. There was something different in his demeanor, a quiet confidence that commanded attention. "You seem very certain of yourself," the partner said, testing him. "Confidence without competence is arrogance," Marcus replied, quoting a principle he had learned from studying Machiavelli's writings. "But competence without confidence is wasted potential. I've done the work. The question is whether you want someone who will execute this flawlessly or someone who will require constant supervision and second-guessing." 3 days later, Marcus was appointed to lead the project. But he knew that winning the opportunity was only the beginning. Machiavelli had written extensively about the challenges of maintaining power once it was gained. The same principles that helped someone rise could be their downfall if not carefully managed. Marcus assembled his team with the same strategic thinking he had applied to securing the position. He didn't simply choose the most qualified people, he selected individuals whose skills complemented each other and whose personal motivations aligned with the project's success. Machiavelli had emphasized the importance of understanding what drove each person and using those motivations to build loyalty and ensure performance. Sarah, a talented graphic designer who had been overlooked for promotions, was hungry to prove herself on a high-profile project. James, a data analyst who thrived on complex challenges, was excited by the analytical demands of the assignment. Maria, a junior account manager who was ambitious and eager to learn, saw working with Marcus as a chance to advance her career. Each team member had something to gain from the project's success, which meant they all had reasons to give their best effort. But Marcus also remembered Machiavelli's warnings about the dangers of being too dependent on others. He made sure to understand every aspect of the project himself, not because he didn't trust his team, but because true leaders never allowed themselves to be in positions where others could hold them hostage with specialized knowledge. The project's early weeks were intense but productive. Marcus applied another of Machiavelli's principles, the importance of being both feared and loved, but never despised. He set high standards and held everyone accountable, but he also made sure to recognize good work and support his team when they faced challenges. When Sarah struggled with a particularly difficult design element, Marcus didn't criticize her publicly. Instead, he worked with her privately to find a solution, then gave her credit for the breakthrough in front of the entire team. However, not everyone was pleased with Marcus's rapid rise. David, a senior account manager who had expected to lead the project himself, began working to undermine Marcus's efforts. He spread rumors about Marcus being overly ambitious, questioned his decisions in meetings, and tried to create doubt about his capabilities among the senior partners. In his previous life, Marcus might have tried to ignore the situation or attempted to win David over with kindness and accommodation. But Machiavelli had written clearly about dealing with enemies. Men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, of more serious ones they cannot. Marcus knew he had to respond decisively. First, Marcus gathered evidence. He documented instances where David had attempted to sabotage the project, collected emails that showed his unprofessional behavior, and identified witnesses who had observed his disruptive actions. But, rather than immediately going to management, Marcus chose a more strategic approach. Marcus scheduled a private meeting with David. During their conversation, he didn't accuse or threaten. Instead, he calmly laid out the situation as he saw it. "David, I respect your experience and your contributions to this company," Marcus said. "But I've noticed some tension around this project, and I think it's affecting the entire team's performance. I'd like to find a way for us to work together effectively." David, expecting confrontation or weakness, was caught off guard by Marcus's professional approach. But when he tried to deny any problems or shift blame, Marcus calmly presented specific examples of the behavior he had documented. It wasn't an attack, it was simply a clear statement of facts. "I'm not looking for an apology or an explanation," Marcus continued. "I'm simply letting you know that I'm aware of what's happening, and I'm hoping we can find a more productive path forward. The success of this project benefits everyone, including you." The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Marcus knew what David was doing, had evidence to prove it, and was giving him one chance to change course before taking more serious action. David, realizing that Marcus was not the pushover he had once been, agreed to be more supportive. But Marcus didn't simply trust that the problem was solved. Machiavelli had warned against the danger of showing mercy to enemies who might strike again when given the opportunity. Marcus continued to monitor David's behavior while also building stronger relationships with other senior colleagues. He made sure that his work spoke for itself and that any future attempts at sabotage would be easily identified and addressed. As spring arrived, the project was ahead of schedule and exceeding expectations. The client was thrilled with the innovative approaches Marcus's team had developed, and the senior partners were beginning to see Marcus as someone with real leadership potential. But success brought new challenges. Other departments began requesting Marcus's involvement in their projects. Colleagues who had barely acknowledged him before were now seeking his advice and support. Invitations to high-level meetings and strategic planning sessions started arriving regularly. The attention was flattering, But Marcus remembered Machiavelli's warnings about the dangers of overextension. A prince should have only one aim and one idea and take up only one profession, and that is war and its conventions and discipline, Machiavelli had written. Marcus interpreted this for his modern context. Focus was essential for maintaining power and effectiveness. He couldn't be everything to everyone without eventually becoming nothing to anyone. Marcus began to decline opportunities that didn't align with his long-term strategic goals. When the marketing director asked him to take on an additional project that would have spread his attention too thin, Marcus politely but firmly declined. "I'm honored by your confidence," he said, "but I believe my current project deserves my complete focus to ensure we deliver exceptional results. Perhaps we could discuss future opportunities once this phase is complete." This selective approach had an unexpected effect. It made Marcus's involvement more valuable. When he did agree to participate in something, people knew it meant he saw real potential in the opportunity. His recommendations carried more weight because he wasn't giving them to everyone about everything. By summer, Marcus had not only successfully completed the original project but had expanded it into 3 additional phases that would generate significant revenue for the company over the next 2 years. The client had specifically requested that Marcus continue leading their account, and the senior partners were discussing partnership opportunities for him. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Marcus carried himself. He no longer sought validation from others because he had learned to validate himself through results and principled action. He didn't need to be the most popular person in the office because he had become one of the most respected. People didn't just like working with Marcus, they wanted to work with him because they knew it would advance their own careers and capabilities. The transformation was evident in small daily interactions. When Marcus walked into a meeting, conversations would pause as people naturally turned their attention to him. His opinions were sought out on important decisions, even in areas outside his direct expertise. Colleagues would mention ideas by saying Marcus suggested or, as Marcus pointed out, using his name to add weight to their own proposals. Yet Marcus was careful not to let this influence go to his head. Machiavelli had written extensively about the dangers of hubris and the importance of remaining connected to reality. Marcus continued to study, to question his own assumptions, and to seek feedback from people he trusted. He had learned that true confidence came from competence and continuous improvement, not from believing his own publicity. The summer also brought personal changes. Marcus's dating life, which had been practically non-existent during his invisible years, had transformed completely. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or desperately seeking companionship. Instead, his confidence and purpose made him naturally attractive to others. He dated selectively, applying the same strategic thinking to his personal relationships that he used in his professional life. When he met Jennifer, a successful architect who shared his appreciation for strategic thinking and personal development, Marcus didn't fall into the old pattern of trying to be whatever she wanted him to be. Instead, he remained authentically himself, confident, purposeful, and slightly unpredictable. The relationship developed naturally because both people were choosing to be together rather than desperately needing each other. As autumn approached, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed. A year ago, he had been invisible, desperate for approval, and completely without real influence. Now he was leading major projects, being considered for partnership, and living a life of genuine purpose and respect. But he also understood that this was not the end of his journey. Machiavelli had written that maintaining power required different skills than gaining it. The principles that had helped Marcus rise would need to be refined and adapted as his responsibilities and opportunities grew. The young man who had discovered the prince in a used bookstore was gone forever. In his place stood someone who understood that true strength came not from being liked by everyone, but from being respected by those who mattered. Marcus had learned to separate himself from the crowd, to think strategically about relationships and opportunities, and to take decisive action when necessary. Most importantly, he had discovered that becoming unstoppable wasn't about being ruthless or manipulative. It was about understanding human nature, respecting your own worth, and having the courage to act on your convictions even when it meant standing alone. The next phase of Marcus's development would test these principles even further, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had built not just a successful career, but an unstoppable mindset that would serve him for the rest of his life. 2 years after discovering Machiavelli's teachings, Marcus faced his greatest challenge yet. The company was going through a major restructuring, and several senior positions were being eliminated or consolidated. The economic climate was uncertain, the industry was evolving rapidly, and everyone was fighting for survival in an increasingly competitive landscape. Many of Marcus's colleagues were panicking, updating their resumes, and networking frantically to secure their positions. But Marcus approached the situation differently. He saw crisis not as a threat to be feared, but as an opportunity to be seized. Machiavelli had written that, in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity, and Marcus intended to prove that principle true. The first thing Marcus did was gather intelligence. While others were focused on protecting what they had, he was studying what the company actually needed to survive and thrive in the changing market. He spent weeks analyzing financial reports, studying competitor strategies, and identifying emerging trends that could create new opportunities for growth. What Marcus discovered was that the company's leadership was focused on cutting costs and preserving existing operations, but they hadn't developed a clear vision for future growth. They were so busy trying to stop the bleeding that they weren't thinking about how to get healthy again. This was exactly the kind of situation where Machiavelli's principles could make the difference between mere survival and actual victory. Marcus began developing what he privately called the Renaissance Plan, a comprehensive strategy for not just weathering the current crisis, but emerging stronger than before. The plan identified 3 untapped market segments, proposed 2 new service offerings that could generate significant revenue, and outlined a streamlined operational structure that would actually improve efficiency while reducing costs. But Marcus knew that having a great plan was only half the battle. Machiavelli had emphasized that timing and presentation were often more important than the content itself. Marcus needed to position his proposal at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way to maximize its impact. The opportunity came during a particularly tense board meeting in November. The senior partners were discussing additional layoffs and service reductions when Marcus requested permission to address the group. Several people looked surprised. Junior partners typically didn't speak during board meetings unless specifically asked to do so. But Marcus had earned enough respect over the past 2 years that his request was granted. Marcus stood and looked around the room at the faces of people who held the company's future in their hands. Many of them looked tired, stressed, and defeated. They were thinking like people under siege rather than leaders with options. It was time to change that perspective. "I've been listening to our discussion about what we need to cut, what we need to eliminate, what we can't afford to do," Marcus began. "These are important considerations in any crisis. But I think we're missing a crucial question: what opportunities are our competitors missing while they're making the same cuts we're considering?" The room was silent. Marcus had their attention. "I've spent the last month analyzing our market position, our competitor strategies, and emerging trends in our industry," Marcus continued. "What I've found is that while everyone is focused on shrinking, there's actually significant opportunity for growth if we're smart about how we approach it." Marcus then presented his Renaissance Plan, but he didn't just outline strategies and projections. He spoke directly to what each person in the room cared about most. To the managing partner who was worried about quarterly earnings, Marcus showed how the plan could improve profitability within 6 months. To the operations director who was concerned about efficiency, he demonstrated how the new structure would actually simplify workflows while improving service quality. Most importantly, Marcus didn't present himself as someone seeking credit or advancement. He positioned himself as someone who had identified solutions to problems that were keeping everyone in the room awake at night. He wasn't asking for anything, he was offering to fix things. The response was immediate and positive. The senior partners asked detailed questions, tested his assumptions, and challenged his projections. But Marcus was prepared for every inquiry. He had anticipated their concerns and had data to support every recommendation. More than that, he demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and crisis leadership that the company desperately needed. By the end of the meeting, the board had approved Marcus's plan and appointed him as the Director of Strategic Development, a newly created position that would report directly to the managing partner. At 30 years old, Marcus had become one of the youngest senior executives in the company's history. But Marcus understood that titles and positions were meaningless without the ability to execute effectively. Machiavelli had written extensively about the difference between those who gained power through inheritance or luck and those who earned it through virtue and capability. Marcus knew he was being judged not on his potential, but on his results. The implementation of the Renaissance plan required Marcus to apply every principle he had learned from Machiavelli. He needed to build alliances with key stakeholders, neutralize potential opposition, and create momentum that would be difficult to stop even if circumstances changed. Marcus began by identifying the people whose support would be essential for success. He didn't just focus on those with formal authority, but also those with informal influence, the long-term employees who others looked to for guidance, the department heads who could make implementation smooth or difficult, and the clients who could provide testimonials and referrals. With each group, Marcus applied different approaches based on their personalities, motivations, and concerns. For the analytical types, he provided detailed data and projections. For the relationship-focused individuals, he emphasized how the changes would improve teamwork and collaboration. For the risk-averse personalities, he outlined contingency plans and safety measures. But Marcus also identified potential sources of resistance. There were several mid-level managers who saw the restructuring as a threat to their territories and influence. Rather than ignoring this opposition or trying to overwhelm it with authority, Marcus chose to address it strategically. He scheduled individual meetings with each potential opponent, not to argue with them or try to convince them they were wrong, but to understand their concerns and find ways to address them. In some cases, this meant modifying aspects of the plan to protect legitimate interests. In other situations, it meant helping people see how they could benefit from the changes rather than be threatened by them. One particularly challenging situation involved Patricia, a veteran account manager who controlled relationships with several major clients. Patricia was worried that the new service offerings would confuse existing clients and potentially damage relationships she had spent years building. Rather than dismissing her concerns, Marcus worked with her to develop a client communication strategy that would preserve her relationships while introducing the new opportunities gradually. The result was that Patricia became one of the plan's strongest advocates because she felt heard, respected, and included in the solution. Machiavelli had written that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done, sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. Marcus understood that dealing with people's actual concerns was more important than pushing through an ideal plan that ignored human nature. As winter progressed into spring, the Renaissance plan began producing results that exceeded even Marcus's projections. The new service offerings were generating significant revenue, the streamlined operations were improving both efficiency and employee satisfaction, and the company was gaining market share while competitors continued to struggle. But the real test came when the industry faced another major disruption. A technological innovation threatened to make traditional approaches obsolete, and many companies were caught completely unprepared. However, Marcus had anticipated this possibility in his strategic planning and had already begun positioning the company to take advantage of the new opportunities. While competitors scrambled to respond to the technological changes, Marcus's company was ready with solutions that integrated the new technology with their existing strengths. They didn't just survive the disruption, they used it to accelerate their growth and establish themselves as industry leaders. The success brought Marcus national recognition within his industry. He was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in trade publications, and recruited by larger companies offering significantly higher compensation. But Marcus had learned from Machiavelli's writings about the importance of loyalty and the dangers of opportunism. Rather than jumping to the highest bidder, Marcus used the external interest to negotiate a partnership agreement with his current company. He would become a full partner, receive equity in the business, and have the autonomy to continue developing innovative strategies. In return, he committed to staying for at least 5 years to see his long-term vision fully implemented. This decision demonstrated another principle Marcus had learned from Machiavelli: true power comes not from constantly seeking the next opportunity, but from building something lasting and meaningful. By choosing stability and loyalty over short-term gains, Marcus strengthened his position while also building trust with his partners and colleagues. The summer brought new challenges as the company's rapid growth required additional systems, processes, and personnel. Marcus found himself managing a much larger team and dealing with more complex organizational dynamics. But he approached these challenges with the same strategic thinking that had served him well throughout his transformation. Marcus established what he called the Inner Circle, a small group of trusted advisors who helped him stay connected to what was happening throughout the organization. These weren't spies or informants, but respected colleagues who shared his commitment to the company's success and could provide honest feedback about both opportunities and problems. He also implemented regular strategic reviews where different departments would present their challenges, successes, and recommendations for improvement. These sessions weren't just reporting meetings, they were opportunities for collaborative problem-solving and strategic alignment. Marcus used them to identify emerging leaders within the organization and to ensure that good ideas could come from anywhere, not just the executive level. But, perhaps most importantly, Marcus never forgot the lessons that had started his transformation. He continued to study, to question his own assumptions, and to remain slightly unpredictable in his approaches. He maintained the separation that had first taught him about his own worth, but he used that strength to serve something larger than himself. By autumn, Marcus had been profiled in a major business magazine as one of the rising stars under 35. The article described his transformation from an overlooked employee to a strategic leader who had helped revolutionize his industry. But what the article couldn't capture was the internal journey that had made the external success possible. Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed since that rainy Tuesday when he had first picked up the Prince. He had learned that becoming unstoppable wasn't about becoming invulnerable or perfect. It was about developing the wisdom to understand human nature, the courage to act on your convictions, and the discipline to continuously improve yourself and your circumstances. The principles he had learned from Machiavelli, separation, strategic thinking, calculated risk-taking, and principled leadership, had become so integrated into his character that they no longer felt like techniques or strategies. They were simply how he approached life. Marcus's relationship with Jennifer had deepened into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. They had bought a house together, traveled to Italy to visit the places where Machiavelli had lived and worked, and begun planning a future that neither had thought possible just a few years earlier. But Marcus understood that success brought its own responsibilities and dangers. He had seen other leaders become complacent, arrogant, or disconnected from the people who had helped them rise. Machiavelli had written extensively about the importance of remaining grounded and continuing to earn one's position every day. Marcus established personal practices to guard against these dangers. He continued to read extensively, not just about business strategy but about history, psychology, and philosophy. He maintained relationships with people at all levels of the organization, not just other executives. He regularly sought feedback from clients, colleagues, and competitors about how he and his company could improve. Most importantly, Marcus never forgot that his power and influence were not ends in themselves, but tools for creating value for others. The companies he served, the employees he led, and the partners he worked with all benefited from his success. This alignment between personal achievement and broader contribution was what made his position truly sustainable. As the year ended, Marcus stood in his new office overlooking the city where his transformation had begun. The view from the executive floor was impressive, but what struck him most was how different the world looked when you approached it with confidence, strategy, and purpose. The invisible, powerless person he had once been seemed like a character from someone else's story. Marcus had learned that becoming unstoppable wasn't about acquiring more power or influence, but about understanding how to use whatever power you had effectively and responsibly. He thought about all the people who were where he had once been, overlooked, undervalued, and convinced that their circumstances were beyond their control. Marcus knew that wasn't true. Everyone had the potential to transform their situation if they were willing to learn, change, and persist through the challenges that growth required. The principles Machiavelli had outlined centuries ago were just as relevant today as they had ever been. The technology changed, the specific circumstances evolved, but human nature remained constant. Those who understood these timeless truths and had the courage to apply them would always have advantages over those who didn't. Marcus Chen had become truly unstoppable not because he was invulnerable to failure or setbacks, but because he had developed the mindset, skills, and principles that would serve him regardless of what challenges the future might bring. He had learned to separate himself from the crowd, to think strategically about opportunities and relationships, and to take decisive action when necessary. Most importantly, he had discovered that the greatest power came not from dominating others, but from mastering himself. The unstoppable presence he had developed was built on a foundation of self-respect, strategic thinking, and principled action that no external circumstances could shake. The journey that had begun with a single book in a used bookstore had transformed not just Marcus's career, but his entire understanding of what was possible when someone truly committed to becoming the best version of themselves. He was no longer the person who hoped others might notice him. He had become the person others hoped to become.